the air inside the Concordance patrol ship was thick with tension as the alien crew stared at the elderly human seated before them. Nathaniel Braxton, known to everyone simply as Nate, leaned back in his chair, his calloused hands cuffed loosely in front of him. He didn't fidget or glance around the room, he just sat there, calm and composed, as though this were just another evening on his farm. "You are in violation of Intergalactic Property Regulation 412C, barked Commander Urith, her voice sharp and commanding. She was tall and rigid, her shimmering cobalt exoskeleton gleaming under the sterile lights. Humans were warned about claiming land on non-registered moons without proper documentation. Nate raised an eyebrow but said nothing, his face betraying neither confusion nor concern. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, letting Uritha's accusation hang in the air. The silence unnerved her crew, who exchanged uneasy glances. "I've been farming that plot for 23 years, Nate finally said, his voice gravelly but steady. Didn't seem to bother anyone until now." Uritha's mandibles clicked in irritation. "Your defiance will not be tolerated. You are to be detained until further notice. Any resistance will be met with force." Nate chuckled, the sound low and dry like the wind over cracked earth. "Force, huh? Against me? I'm an old man with a bad back and arthritis. What do you think I'm gonna do? Wrestle your soldiers?" Uritha's golden eyes narrowed. "You underestimate the consequences of your actions, human." "No," Nate said softly, his tone suddenly shifting, "I think it's you underestimating me." Urith waved a hand, and 2 guards stepped forward, their weapons raised. Nate didn't resist as they hauled him to his feet and led him through the labyrinthine corridors of the ship. His boots scuffed against the polished metal floor, his body slumped as though burdened by years of toil. But his eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned every corner, every doorway, every vulnerable point. Inside the brig, they shoved him into a cell, the force field crackling to life behind him. Nate stretched his neck and yawned as if settling in for a nap. Urith stood on the other side of the barrier, watching him like a predator eyeing wounded prey. "I'd get some rest if I were you," she said coldly. "You'll need it." Nate smirked. "Thanks for the advice, Commander." Urith stormed out, her heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. Once the sound faded, Nate leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. For several minutes, he remained motionless, his breathing slow and steady. But his mind was a hive of activity, piecing together the layout of the ship, the positions of the guards, the rhythms of their patrols. It was all instinct now, a muscle memory honed over decades of experience. The silence was broken by the faint hum of the force field deactivating. Nate's eyes snapped open to see an alien technician fumbling with the controls. The young officer's scales shimmered nervously as he avoided eye contact. "You're being transferred to the high-security wing," the technician stammered, his voice trembling. "Commander's orders." Nate smiled faintly. "Sure thing, son." As the technician turned, Nate moved with startling speed, twisting the alien's arm and spinning him into the wall. The guard yelped as Nate relieved him of his weapon, a sleek energy baton, and pressed it gently against the base of his neck. "Now, let's have a little chat," Nate said, his voice calm but firm. "How many guards between here and the main deck?" I don't know," the alien sputtered. "Wrong answer." Nate adjusted the baton's setting, and it buzzed menacingly. "Try again." 7, the alien blurted out. 3 in the corridors, 4 on the main deck. "Good boy," Nate said, releasing him. "Now, do me a favor and pretend you didn't see anything." The alien slumped to the floor, his eyes wide with fear as Nate slipped out of the cell. He moved like a shadow, his steps light and deliberate. Every turn, every passage, every decision was precise, as though he'd memorized the ship's schematics long before stepping aboard. The first 2 guards didn't even see him coming. A quick jab to the neck and a sweep of the legs left them unconscious on the cold floor. Nate paused only long enough to take a comm device from one of their belts before continuing on. By the time he reached the main deck, the ship was on high alert. Alarms blared, and red lights flashed as the crew scrambled to locate their escaped prisoner. Nate crouched behind a console, observing the chaos with a hint of amusement. "Lock down the exits." Eurytha's voice boomed over the intercom. "He's not getting off this ship alive." Nate tapped the comm device, cycling through frequencies until he found what he was looking for. The alien voices crackling through the speaker were frantic, disorganized. He keyed into their panic, feeding off it like a predator stalking its prey. "Attention all units," he said, mimicking Eurytha's tone perfectly. "Report to Deck 5 immediately. Priority 1. The crew hesitated, their confusion palpable. But the urgency in Nate's fabricated command was enough to spur them into action. One by one, the guards filed out, leaving the main deck eerily quiet. Nate stood, adjusting his stolen uniform and slipping into the captain's chair as though he belonged there. His fingers danced across the controls, bypassing security protocols with a skill that belied his age. The ship's systems bent to his will, cameras looping false footage, doors locking and unlocking at his command. Euryth stormed onto the deck moments later, her fury radiating like heat waves. She froze when she saw Nate, comfortably seated at the helm, his boots propped up on the console. "Morning, Commander," Nate drawled. "Sleep well?" Her mandibles clicked furiously. "How?" "You really should secure your comms better," Nate said, cutting her off. "And maybe hire some smarter guards while you're at it." Euryth lunged for her weapon, but Nate was faster. He spun the chair, drawing a concealed blade from his boot and holding it inches from her throat. Now, he said softly. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Euryth glared at him, her pride warring with her survival instincts. Slowly, she raised her hands in surrender. "You don't understand what you're doing," she hissed. "This isn't just about you. The Concordance will." "The Concordance doesn't scare me," Nate interrupted. "You should know that by now." He leaned closer, his eyes hard and unyielding. "Now, you're going to deactivate the tractor beam and let me walk out of here. Or we can see how long it takes your crew to mutiny when they find out how badly you've botched this." Euryth hesitated, her jaw clenched. But the gleam in Nate's eyes left no room for negotiation. With a reluctant growl, she entered the override code, and the tractor beam powered down. "Smart choice," Nate said, lowering his blade. "You're learning." As he stepped off the ship and onto the docking platform, Nate turned back to give her a parting smile. "Next time you arrest someone, Commander, maybe do your homework first." The Concordance ship rattled as enemy fire struck its shields, sending alien crew members tumbling across the bridge. Alarms wailed, drowning out the panicked shouts of officers scrambling to regain control. In the chaos, Commander Euryth gripped the railing tightly, her mandibles clicking in frustration as she barked orders. "Divert power to the forward shields. I want those thrusters operational now." "It's not enough, Commander," a junior officer yelled, his claws skittering over the console. "Their ships outmatch us in firepower and maneuverability." Eurytha's golden eyes narrowed as the vessel shuddered under another barrage. Her pride bristled at the idea of retreating, but the reality was unavoidable. They were outgunned, and their prisoner, a human they'd underestimated, was loose somewhere on the ship. This mission had spiraled into disaster faster than she could comprehend. From the shadows of the bridge, Nate Braxton watched the scene unfold, his weathered face impassive. He had managed to slip past the guards during the ambush, using the confusion to his advantage. Years of experience had taught him that panic was a weapon, one that could be wielded against those too inexperienced to control it. "Commander," Nate's gravelly voice cut through the noise like a blade, startling the crew. He stepped into the light, hands raised casually, a faint smirk on his face. "Looks like you've got yourself a problem." Eurytha's head snapped toward him, her mandibles flaring. "You're the problem, human." "Guards." "No time for that," Nate said, gesturing toward the holographic display of enemy ships encircling them. "You're about to get vaporized unless you start listening." The crew hesitated, their eyes darting between their enraged commander and the calm human who had somehow infiltrated the bridge. Eurytha's claws twitched, but the next explosion nearly threw her off her feet. Her pride screamed to deny him, but her survival instincts forced her hand. "Speak," she snapped, her tone like acid. "And make it quick." Nate strolled forward, ignoring the weapons now trained on him. "Your enemies out there? They're not here for your ship. They're here for me." He tapped the side of his head. "Let's just say I've got some information they'd kill to get their claws on." "Why?" Yurith demanded. "What could you possibly know?" Nate's smirk widened. "Oh, you'd be surprised what a simple farmer like me knows. But we'll save story time for later. Right now, your best chance at survival is letting me help you." Yuritha's mandibles clicked in frustration, but the desperation in the eyes of her crew sealed her decision. "Fine. What do you suggest?" "First," Nate said, his tone suddenly sharp, "cut the engines. Make it look like you've gone dead in the water. They'll think they've disabled you and move into board." "And then?" Yurith asked, suspicion lacing her voice. "Then," Nate said, glancing at the tactical display, "we spring a little trap." Under Nate's direction, the crew executed his plan with reluctant efficiency. The ship powered down its thrusters, and the shields flickered as though on the brink of failure. The enemy fleet closed in, their smaller crafts darting toward the Concordance ship like vultures circling a carcass. "Here's the fun part," Nate said, leaning over the navigation console. He pointed to a cluster of debris drifting nearby. "Use the tractor beam to sling those fragments toward the enemy. Aim for their thrusters. You don't need to destroy them, just slow them down." Yuritha's mandibles twitched, but she relayed the order. The crew worked furiously, channeling the tractor beam to hurl chunks of metal toward the advancing ships. The fragments struck true, disabling two of the smaller crafts and forcing the rest to scatter. "They're regrouping," an officer called out. "Of course they are," Nate muttered. "Now, let's give them something else to worry about." He pointed to the ship's stealth modules, currently offline. "Reactivate those and fire a few warning shots, just enough to make them think you've got reinforcements." "They'll hesitate." Yurith hesitated herself, her pride chafing at the thought of taking orders from a human. But the flicker of hope in her crew's eyes overrode her doubts. "Do it." The stealth modules hummed to life, cloaking sections of the ship in shimmering darkness. The crew fired precision shots, carefully aimed to miss but close enough to unnerve the enemy. As predicted, the hostile fleet pulled back slightly, their formation faltering. Yurith turned to Nate, her expression begrudgingly curious. "How do you know this will work?" "Let's just say I've danced this dance before," Nate replied cryptically. "Your enemies think like predators. Show them you're not easy prey, and they'll reconsider their options." The tactical display beeped as one of the enemy ships broke formation and began transmitting a message. Yuritha's eyes widened as the translation appeared on screen. "They're offering to negotiate," she said, incredulous. Nate nodded. "Typical. They want to figure out what's really going on before committing more resources. Now's your chance to turn the tables." Yurith stared at him, her pride and pragmatism warring within her. Finally, she gave a curt nod. "Patch them through." The image of a snarling alien captain filled the screen, his features twisted in a mix of anger and confusion. "Concordance vessel, explain your actions. Surrender the human, and we may spare your crew." Yurith opened her mouth to speak, but Nate stepped forward, cutting her off. "Sorry, pal," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "But I don't think your buddies here are in a position to make demands." The captain's eyes narrowed. "Who are you to speak for them, human?" "Oh, just a concerned citizen," Nate replied, his tone deceptively casual. "One who happens to know your little operation isn't exactly sanctioned by the Concordance. How do you think they'll react when they find out you've been running rogue ops on their turf?" The captain's snarl faltered, uncertainty flickering across his face. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Nate said, raising an eyebrow. "Go ahead. Call their central command. Ask them if they've authorized this attack. I'll wait." The silence that followed was deafening. Eurytha's crew exchanged glances, their earlier fear replaced by a flicker of hope. The enemy captain growled low in his throat but didn't reply. "That's what I thought," Nate said. "Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to back off, and you're going to leave the sector. Otherwise, I make one call, and the full weight of the Concordance falls on your sorry hides." The captain glared at him, but the hesitation in his eyes betrayed his doubts. Finally, he snarled a command to his crew, and the enemy ships began retreating, their weapons powering down. As the hostile fleet vanished into the void, the Concordance crew erupted into cheers. Euryth turned to Nate, her expression unreadable. "You manipulated them," she said, her voice laced with both awe and disdain. Nate shrugged. "Sometimes, all it takes is making someone believe you've got the upper hand. Even when you don't." Euryth studied him for a long moment before finally inclining her head. "You've earned your reprieve, human. For now." Nate smirked. "Glad to be of service." The Concordance ship was eerily quiet in the aftermath of the retreat. Commander Euryth stood at the center of the bridge, her sharp eyes scanning the damage reports flooding in on the tactical display. Though the immediate threat had passed, her mandibles clicked in frustration. Her crew whispered cautiously, stealing glances at the human seated casually at a console, his boots tapping lightly against the metal floor as if he owned the place. "I assume you have something to say, human," Euryth said coldly, breaking the silence. Nate Braxton didn't look up. His fingers moved deftly over the interface, sifting through encrypted files with practiced ease. "Just taking stock of the situation, Commander. Looks like you've got bigger problems than a few ships trying to pick a fight." Euryth stalked toward him, her claws clinking against the metal floor. "Enlighten me, then. Since you seem so eager to involve yourself in Concordance affairs." "Eager isn't the word I'd use." Nate leaned back, crossing his arms. "But I can't stand sloppy work. And you, Commander, have walked straight into a setup." Eurytha's golden eyes narrowed. "Explain." "Those ships weren't just rogue mercenaries. They're pawns in a much bigger game." He tapped the console, and a series of intercepted communications appeared on the main display. "Your precious Concordance has a rat problem. Someone high up fed them your location, knowing you'd come after me. My guess? They wanted you to fail." Eurytha's mandibles twitched, a rare flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "Why would anyone in the Concordance orchestrate this? And why involve you?" "Because I'm a loose end." Nate's voice dropped, a sharp edge slicing through his otherwise calm demeanor. "I know things about Earth's little tussles with the Concordance that certain folks would rather stay buried. Guess someone figured I was easier to silence if I ended up collateral damage." Euryth loomed over him, her voice tight with suspicion. "You're accusing my superiors of treason? On what basis?" Nate shrugged. "On the basis that I've been playing this game longer than you've been alive, Commander. And the rules haven't changed." A younger officer, her scales pale with fear, stepped forward hesitantly. "Commander, if he's right, if someone within the Concordance orchestrated this attack." Euryth silenced her with a sharp gesture. "We have no proof." "Proof's overrated," Nate said, his voice calm but cutting. "But evidence? That, I can get you." The tension in the room was palpable as Nate turned back to the console, his hands moving with mechanical precision. A few moments later, the display filled with a map of a nearby star system, overlaid with pulsating markers. "Here's the thing about conspiracies," he said. "The people pulling the strings always leave a trail. The ones who attacked us. They've got a supply line running through this system. Cut it off, and we'll find out who's bankrolling them." Euryth crossed her arms, skepticism etched across her face. "And you're suggesting we follow your lead? Just like that?" "Not like you've got better options," Nate replied, his tone maddeningly casual. "Unless you'd prefer to report back empty-handed and let your superiors pin this mess on you." Her mandibles flared, but she couldn't argue with his logic. She turned to her crew, her voice sharp and commanding. "Prepare the ship for jump. We're heading to the designated system." and someone keep an eye on him. Nate smirked. You're learning, Commander. The journey through hyperspace was tense, the air thick with unspoken questions. Nate remained at the console, a quiet sentinel as the crew worked around him. Yurith kept her distance, though her eyes never strayed far from the enigmatic human. She couldn't decide if he was an ally, a threat, or something far more dangerous. When they emerged from hyperspace, the star system unfolded before them like a tapestry of light and shadow. Nate pointed to a cluster of asteroid fields. There. That's where they're hiding. How can you be so sure? Yurith demanded. Because it's what I do, he said simply. The ship moved cautiously into the field, its scanners sweeping the area. The crew held their breath as the debris parted to reveal a hidden station, its surface bristling with weapons and activity. Yuritha's voice was a low growl. They'll see us coming a mile away. That's the point, Nate replied. They're not going to run. Not yet. Not until they think they've got the upper hand. What's the plan, then? Yurith asked, her frustration boiling over. Or do you intend to keep improvising? Improvising's what humans do best, Nate said with a grin. But since you asked, here's the plan. We send out a distress signal. Make it look like your ship's dead in the water again. They'll take the bait, and when they do, we'll board that station and get what we need. Yuritha's eyes narrowed. You're proposing we engage in an infiltration mission with no backup, no intel, and no guarantee of success. Pretty much, Nate said, rising to his feet. But if you've got a better idea, I'm all ears. She stared at him, the weight of command heavy on her shoulders. Finally, she gave a curt nod. Do it. The crew worked quickly, broadcasting the distress signal as the ship powered down its systems. As expected, the station responded, a small fleet of armed crafts closing in to investigate. Yuritha's ship lay silent, a predator feigning weakness. When the enemy boarded, they found nothing but empty halls. Nate and Yuritha's team had already slipped aboard the station, using the chaos to their advantage. Moving through the labyrinthine corridors, they encountered little resistance, the enemy caught off guard by their audacity. Inside the central control room, Nate hacked into the station's database, his movements precise and efficient. Yurith watched him, her skepticism slowly giving way to grudging respect. Got it, Nate said, his voice triumphant. Names, locations, accounts, enough dirt to make the Concordance squirm. Good, Yurith said. Now let's get out of here. The escape was anything but smooth. The station's defenses activated, and alarms blared as the team fought their way back to the ship. Nate was a blur of motion, his instincts honed from decades of experience. He barked orders, covered their flanks, and kept the crew moving, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos. When they finally launched, the station erupted in a cascade of explosions, the result of Nate's parting gift, a timed overload of its power core. As the ship sped away, Yurith turned to Nate, her voice tinged with reluctant gratitude. You saved my crew. And my command. Nate gave her a lopsided grin. All in a day's work. But don't think for a moment this absolves you, she added, her tone hardening. You're still a liability. And I will find out who you really are. Nate leaned against the console, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Looking forward to it, Commander. Looking forward to it. The ship was eerily silent as it floated just outside Concordance space, cloaked by its newly repaired stealth system. The crew moved with quiet determination, their usual confidence tempered by the weight of what they had uncovered. Nate Braxton sat in the corner of the command deck, his eyes fixed on the console displaying the data they had retrieved. His presence was no longer met with suspicion or disdain, though a few crew members still cast wary glances his way. Commander Yurith stood at the center of the room, her golden eyes scanning the information as her claws tapped a restless rhythm against her arm. This evidence, she said finally, her voice low, implicates some of the most powerful figures in the Concordance. It's not just treason. It's war. Not yet, Nate said, his voice steady. Right now, it's leverage. Yurith turned sharply, her mandibles clicking in frustration. Leverage? You think this is a game, human? Lives are at stake. Entire systems could burn. Nate rose slowly, his calm demeanor unshaken by her outburst. You think I don't know that? I've been in the middle of this kind of mess more times than I can count. The moment you go public with this, you lose control. The ones pulling the strings will spin it, bury it, or worse, escalate until no one can stop them. You don't win wars by firing the first shot. You win by making sure the other side can't afford to fire theirs. Yurith glared at him, but his words had struck a chord. She glanced back at the screen, the weight of command pressing heavily on her shoulders. What do you suggest, then? Call them out, Nate said. Not with accusations, with a trap. Give them just enough rope to hang themselves. Draw them into the open where they can't hide. And how do you propose we do that? Yurith asked, skepticism dripping from her tone. Easy, Nate said, pulling up the communications log they had intercepted. We know who they are, where they meet, and how they operate. Leak a bit of intel back to them, something they'll recognize as a threat. Make them think their secret's out. They'll panic, and when they do, they'll make mistakes. We follow the breadcrumbs and expose them for what they are. Yurith studied him for a long moment, her sharp features unreadable. You speak as though you've done this before. I have, Nate replied simply. And I'm still here. That's more than I can say for most of the people who tried to stop me. Her mandibles clicked again, a nervous habit Nate had learned to recognize. Finally, she gave a curt nod. Do it. The crew worked quickly, their movements precise and efficient as they prepared the false transmission. Yurith supervised the operation, her eyes flicking toward Nate occasionally as if trying to decipher the enigma that was this human. He remained calm, offering advice and adjustments where needed but never overstepping. It was a delicate balance, one he navigated with practiced ease. When the transmission was sent, the waiting began. The minutes stretched into hours, the tension aboard the ship thick enough to cut. Nate sat in silence, his gaze distant, as though he were reliving battles fought long ago. Yurith finally broke the silence, her voice softer than usual. Why do you do this, human? You could have walked away. You should have. Yet here you are, risking everything for people who aren't even your own. Nate didn't look at her. Because someone has to. And because I've seen what happens when no one does. Before Yurith could respond, the console beeped, signaling an incoming message. The crew snapped to attention, their eyes fixed on the screen as the transmission played. A high-ranking Concordance official appeared, his expression tight with barely concealed anger. This is Counselor Rivar of the High Concordance. We have received your interesting transmission. I trust you understand the gravity of your claims. Yurith stepped forward, her posture rigid. Counselor, the data we've collected is irrefutable. Certain members of this body have betrayed the Concordance and its principles. We intend to ensure justice is served. Rivar's mandibles twitched, his voice dangerously calm. Justice, Commander? Or treason? Be very careful how you proceed. The weight of the Concordance is not something a single ship can bear. Nate stepped into view, his presence drawing a collective intake of breath from the crew. Rivar's eyes widened slightly, recognition flashing across his face. You, Rivar hissed. I should have known. This has your stink all over it. Good to see you too, Rivar, Nate said, his tone maddeningly casual. Been a while. Still selling out your own people for a seat at the big table? Rivar's composure slipped, his voice rising. You don't know what you're talking about, human. Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about, Nate said, stepping closer to the screen. And so will the rest of the galaxy when this goes public. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to make a deal. Yurith shot him a sharp look, but he ignored her, his focus entirely on the counselor. Rivar hesitated, his eyes darting as though calculating his next move. What do you want? Rivar finally asked, his voice a low growl. Simple, Nate said. You call off your dogs, clean house in the Concordance, and disappear quietly. No more backroom deals, no more power plays. You walk away, and we keep this between us. And if I refuse? Rivar demanded. Nate's smile was cold. Then you'll find out just how loud a human with nothing to lose can be. The silence that followed was deafening. Rivar stared at him, his expression a mix of anger and resignation. Finally, he let out a hiss of frustration. Fine, he said. You win this time. But don't think for a moment this is over. Oh, I'm counting on it, Nate said, his tone almost cheerful. See you around, Rivar. The transmission ended, leaving the crew in stunned silence. Yurith turned to Nate, her expression unreadable. You let him go. For now, Nate said. But he's on borrowed time. People like him always trip over their own arrogance eventually. And what about you? Yurith asked. What happens now? Nate smiled faintly. Now, I go back to my farm. I've had enough excitement for one lifetime. Yurith watched him for a long moment, then gave a grudging nod. You're a strange creature, human. But, thank you. Don't mention it, Nate said, turning toward the exit. Seriously. Don't. As he disappeared down the corridor, the crew exchanged uncertain glances, their lives forever changed by the human who had walked into their midst and turned their world upside down.